Hey, welcome to Crash Course U.S. History, where we're exploring the weird, wild, and wonderful stories that shaped the United States. In our last episode, we talked about how the idea of manifest destiny, or the belief that it was America's God-given right to expand across the North American continent, fueled U.S. territorial growth in the 1800s. But one of the darkest chapters in this story involves the institution of slavery and its role in shaping the history of the United States. So today, we're going to talk about slavery in the United States and how we remember it today. The enslavement of Africans in the Americas started before the United States even existed. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, where they were sold to colonists who had just founded the first permanent English settlement at Jamestown. The colonists used the enslaved people to work on plantations growing cash crops like tobacco, which they could sell for profit in Europe, and those profits would help fuel the colonial economy. Enslaved Africans did the labor-intensive work of planting and harvesting crops for a few pennies or none at all. They were denied an education and considered property rather than human beings. If they weren't killed or injured from overwork or the lash, their life expectancy was shorter than those who lived in freedom due to deadly diseases brought over from Europe. But even under these brutal conditions, enslaved people created families and communities and resisted enslavement in various ways, sometimes through running away or by hiding, and sometimes by rebelling. As the colonies grew, so did the number of enslaved people in America. By 1770, there were over 200,000 of them concentrated in the southern colonies. At this time, the northern colonies had fewer enslaved people, and many had already started to question the morality of slavery. So while it continued legally in New York and other northern states, it gradually ended there through meaning the act of granting freedom to enslaved people. Meanwhile, the southern colonies' reliance on enslaved labor led to the expansion of slavery there. So by the time of the American Revolution, the institution had become deeply rooted in the South. One of the major debates leading up to the American Revolution was over the institution of slavery. Some argued that the revolutionaries should fight for the end of slavery in America, but most, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, saw the issue of slavery as a threat to the Union, with northern states moving toward abolition and southern states wanting to maintain the right to own enslaved people. The Founding Fathers feared that this conflict would tear the nation apart, so instead of abolishing slavery, they passed laws to protect the institution. For example, the Three-Fifths Compromise counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining representation in Congress and taxation. But in exchange for this compromise, they also agreed to abolish the slave trade and allow for the gradual emancipation of enslaved people. But they didn't keep their word, and the slave trade continued. So in the early years of the United States, enslaved people continued to do the labor-intensive work of planting and harvesting crops and building the country. But some of them found ways to resist. Many maintained their African cultures by continuing to speak their native languages and forming tight-knit communities. Others converted to Christianity, which gave them new hope and a basis for resisting slavery. Leaders like Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner organized rebellions, but they often faced violent suppression that left many enslaved people dead. By the mid-1800s, the debate over slavery intensified as the nation grew and the United States acquired more territory. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state to keep the balance of power between slave and free states in the Senate equal, but it also drew a line across the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, prohibiting slavery north of that line and allowing it south of it. However, in 1837, Texas annexed and brought slavery with it, upsetting the balance of power between slave and free states. This led to further debates over slavery and the balance of power between slave and free states, and eventually the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. After the war, the United States acquired vast amounts of new territory in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but the question of whether or not slavery would be allowed in these territories became a major point of contention. As a result, the U.S. government organized the Oregon Territory, Utah Territory, New Mexico, and California into what's known as a slave-free area. But in doing so, Southerners felt that their interests were being ignored and their power in Congress diminished. And as a result, the divide between the North and the South grew ever wider. Meanwhile, the issue of slavery also contributed to the rise of reform movements in the decades before the Civil War. People began to question the nation's commitment to liberty and equality when it came to the treatment of enslaved people. Many Northerners, for example, joined abolitionist societies and worked to end slavery and the slave trade, sometimes by publishing anti-slavery newspapers and pamphlets, sometimes by helping enslaved people escape, and sometimes by petitioning Congress to end slavery. However, Southerners argued that the economy of the South relied on the labor of enslaved people. So if the institution of slavery ended, the entire economy of the South would collapse. Abolitionists, however, argued that ending slavery would bring positive change. Writers like Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from slavery himself, spoke out against the injustice of the institution, and demanded immediate emancipation. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, was published in 1845 and became an instant success, selling more than 3,000 copies within weeks. But as sectional tensions rose, Southerners became increasingly concerned about what they perceived as Northern interference in their way of life. So in response to abolitionist activity in the South, Southern states passed restrictive laws known as the Slave Codes. These codes denied basic rights to enslaved people, prohibited gatherings of more than 3 people unless a white person was present, and punished those who aided enslaved people escaping from bondage. Now, as the debate over slavery grew louder and louder, eventually erupting into the Civil War, the United States began to change. And with it, our memory of the United States began to change. You see, remembering the past is essential to understanding who we are today and where we came from. Historians and other folks who study the past search for primary sources like diaries, photographs, and speeches to learn about what life was like in the past. And public historians use these sources to teach others about the past in museums, historic sites, and other public spaces. But deciding which stories get told and remembered and which ones get forgotten shapes our understanding of the past, and can even help determine who has power in the present. Today, several organizations work to preserve and share the stories of enslaved people and their descendants. The National Park Service manages 41 sites related to slavery and Jim Crow across 9 states. The Museum and Memorial of the former site of the slave trade in the Old South tells the stories of the people who were bought and sold there. Historic sites like Montpelier, the estate of James Madison, the 4th President of the United States, have created exhibits and programs to tell the full story of enslaved people who lived and worked there. But even with these efforts, remembering the history of slavery and racism remains difficult for Americans today. For example, in 2015, officials in Charleston, South Carolina, voted to remove the Confederate flag from the Capitol building after a white supremacist murdered 9 African Americans at a historically black church. But the debate over the flag's meaning and symbolism continues. Some view the flag as representing heritage and pride, while others see it as a symbol of racism and oppression. In June 2020, amid nationwide protests against police brutality and racial injustice, protesters in Richmond, Virginia, pulled down a statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. But many of the monuments erected during the Jim Crow era remain standing across the United States. These difficult conversations and debates over public symbols illustrate the challenges of confronting the toughest parts of American history. Acknowledging the reality of slavery and its legacy requires acknowledging the humanity of those who were enslaved and the humanity of those who inflicted such violence and dehumanization upon them. But without acknowledging both sides of this story, we cannot begin to heal from the wounds of the past. We do want to have to look far back in history to see how difficult it can be to confront the toughest parts of our shared past. Just think about the history that your own community remembers, and how access to that history shapes how we see ourselves today. What parts of history have been forgotten or erased? Who has the power to decide what gets remembered and why? What responsibility do we have to make sure that all voices are heard? And with that, we've reached the end of another Crash Course episode. If you want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can join our community on a crowdfunding platform. Our community of supporters makes sure that we can keep making Crash Course and that we can continue to cover underrepresented histories and stories. With your support, we can keep Crash Course free for everyone forever.